Okay, so today I will talk about cover crops or intermediate crops. I think it's a more correct way to describe it, and these kind of crops as a source of proteins. And I'm a researcher at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences in the plant breeding department in a group called Plant Product Quality. So I'm involved in different projects about quality and what cultivation and storage means for product quality. So a little bit of background. As you all know, there is an increased demand for locally produced green proteins. We have to be more self-sufficient. We are far too dependent on the import of soybean proteins, for example. And to be able to increase this plant-based protein production, we can, of course, increase the yield per hectare, but we can also increase the use of the agricultural biomass. So green biomass, then, that is a potential source of proteins. And I have seen in the literature that this green part, the area parts of the plant, the leaves and stem, for example, they can contain between 1.6 and 15% of proteins. So that might be a good raw material for protein production. So the idea is then to extract these proteins from this green biomass in so-called plant protein factories. And that is then a way to use the residues from the farming and turn that into proteins, plant proteins that are valuable for different kinds of applications. And that will give an added value for the produce, of course, and the farmer. And we have such a plant protein factory at SLU. And that is a pilot plant then to develop methods and processes for extraction of proteins and protein fractions. And that is developed at our campus in Alnarp, and that is outside Malmö. And this is about resource efficiency. Then we can use crops and crop residues to produce products that can be used in food industry and to produce cosmetic and healthcare products and in the fodder industry. So it's a way to use all parts of the plant, a multi-use, I would say. And except for extracting proteins, it's possible to extract also other parts, other components like fibers and antioxidants. That, of course, also would be an added value. So to get back to the background, intermediate crops, and I will call that IC for convenience, that is an example of such green biomass. And an intermediate crop, that is a crop that is grown between two main crops, for example, between barley and wheat, for example, or after potatoes or something. And that is used for different reasons. Some of the reasons might be to reduce the nitrogen leakage or to increase the soil organic matter or as weed control. So there is a potential cultivation area for this kind of crops in Sweden, and that is 194,000 hectares, and that is a figure that is suggested by my colleague Thomas Prade. And in 2018, only 70,000 hectares were used for cultivation of intermediate crops, but there is a potential larger cultivation area. And these intermediate crops, they are usually incorporated in the soil as green manure, but there are also ongoing projects about using intermediate crops as for biogas production. And several of these crops that we use as intermediate crops, they have seeds with quite a high protein content. For example, buckwheat and hemp, but we don't know that much about the protein content in other parts of those plants, for example, in the stem and leaves. But potentially, these intermediate crops could be used for extracting proteins in a plant protein factory. And then, of course, we need to know more about the content, protein content. So then we made a field trial, and actually this field trial was planned as a weed trial actually, but we thought that we could use this for other kind of analysis as well. So we used 4 different species: buckwheat, hemp, phacelia, and oilseed radish. And within the brackets, you can see the name of the different cultivars. And we had this field trial in the south of Sweden, in Skåne. And we were also interested in if a nitrogen fertilization would make any difference. And then also if the harvest time resulted in any difference in the protein content. So that was basically what we aimed for, to look at different species, to see any difference between fertilized and non-fertilized, and if there are any differences depending on harvest time. So yeah, more detailed pictures of the different crops that we had in the field trial. And when harvesting these crops, we assess the biomass yield in smaller plots and then try to calculate for a bigger area. And we dry the material and milled it, and it was a little bit hard to mill the hemp, I would say, especially later during the autumn, because it was almost all fibers in these parts of the hemp. And then we decided the protein concentration in these aerial parts as a nitrogen content, and converted that into a protein proportion, and used this conversion factor of 5.6. And also a kind of economic assessment where we try to relate the production costs correlate production costs to the protein value. And then we had to make a lot of assumptions regarding the production costs and what kind of proteins we were interested in, and the pathways how to extract those proteins, and possible sales prices. And the assumption was that this material was used wet and pressed for juice, and then the proteins were extracted from that juice. And we were interested in 2 different types of proteins, white and green proteins, and I will tell you a little bit more about that later. So this economic assessment is quite complicated, and that is done by my colleague, and I'm not really into that, what he's doing, but there's a lot of assessments and a lot models used. So I will not tell you that much about how to do it, but some of the results. So if we look at the protein content in these different crops, it's quite obvious that two of the crops, hemp and oilseed radish, they have a little bit higher levels of protein than buckwheat and phacelia. And then it's also quite obvious that there are no big differences between unfertilized and fertilized, actually, when it comes to protein content. It's quite similar. But you can see there is a decline later in the autumn. If you harvest the crops later in the autumn, there is a lower level of protein content. But quite obvious, if you look at the biomass production, of course, there is an impact. The fertilization has an impact on the outcome. Of course, you get more biomass when you add fertilizer. And there are for some of the crops, you see there is an increase in biomass production. You get more higher levels later in the autumn, and in others, like in buckwheat, for example, there are quite obvious a decrease in biomass production, and that is, yeah, that was quite obvious when you looked at the field, out in the field when you harvested the different crops. So if you look at the economic assessment, then of course there is a variation between crops and between harvest dates and between if it's fertilized or not. That will of course affect the protein recovery. We also repeated this field trial one more year, and there's also a difference between years, actually. Higher levels in some years and lower in others. And of course that affects the outcome of this, the income. And if you say very, very approximately based on these results, that if you have a 5,000 kilogram dry matter per hectare, and approximately 10% of that is protein, potentially you can get 500 kilo protein per hectare, but that's probably a little bit optimistic, because most of it, a part of it is probably not recoverable, because we used this in, we used the lab. I mean, this is lab-based results, and it's a little bit different in the real world when you're trying to make it as a bigger process in a factory. And those two proteins that we were interested in, it's, you can get an extraction of a white protein, and that is mainly it's mainly Rubisco, and that is a protein of highest value that could be used for human consumption. And then we have one part, a green protein, and that is also a good source of protein, but it's not tasting that good, actually. So that could be used for feed. And to increase profit, of course, you should also try to extract fibers and bioactive compounds from this. So as a conclusion, this green biomass has a potential as a raw material for extraction of protein-rich food, proteins for protein-rich food and feed. And there is a variation, of course, among the crops and the dates and the fertilization that in turn affects the profit. And as I said, I am not going into details in this assessment of economic because it's not my area. But there is a publication in progress based on these field trials, and that is on this publication is under revision, and hopefully it will be published in the beginning of next year, in January or February or something. And if you're interested in this economic assessment, you can find this publication and read more about that. It's quite detailed, actually, and this list of authors is more or less the group that has been working on this intermediate crop field trial. So that was in short summary of these trials on intermediate crops. So thank you for listening, and do you have any questions?
Okay, thank you, Lena, for interesting presentation. I would imagine that will raise quite a few questions. I have one question just for a start. You were talking about the white protein fraction there.
Yeah.
Maybe I missed it. How much of the total protein fraction is the white protein fraction?
Oh, I don't know. There are projects ongoing trying to extract that white protein fraction as such. I have no figures right now. I would guess 10-20% perhaps of the protein fraction as such is the white protein, but I'm not sure really about the proportion actually, but I would guess something like that.
Okay. I have another question. That was about establishment. How do you now you establish these crops? As far as I understood, in start of July.
Yeah.
And then you did it after potatoes, but it was
no. This field trial it was after barley, I think. Mm.
So and the barley you of course you didn't harvest it mature or at grain harvest, or was it harvested as a green crop?
It was harvested as a green crop. In this case, yeah.
Okay, yeah. I'm just curious. Yeah.
Elena?
Yeah.
I have a question also regarding the white protein, the rubisco. Isn't it more or less just in the green part of the plants?
Yeah.
And what about in autumn when the green plant is going back?
Yeah. Yeah. The total amount of proteins in some of the crops you saw, it was decreasing later in the autumn, but some of it, the hemp, for example, the hemp continued to grow quite a lot late in the autumn, and of course, if you can harvest fine green leaves, of course you can also extract quite good proteins out of it. So it depends a little bit on the crop, I think. It was quite obvious from the buckwheat, for example, that it really looked awful in the end of the autumn. And then, of course, you cannot extract that much rubisco out of that. It depends a little bit on the crop, I think.
Mm. And what about the time? When do farmers grow cover crops? I think in the last summer and over the winter.
Yeah, between two main crops. So whichever main crops you have, you grow it in between.
So they are winter hard, the crops, and you can have it over winter. And I can't imagine that you can harvest it in springtime.
No, they have it between the crops in the summer.
Aha.
I think,
Okay.
yeah. Because they are not winter hardy.
Yeah.
No.
More questions? Okay, Helena, then I think we'll say thank you.